Well, welcome everyone. It's really special to see so many of you here. I think you're going to enjoy this. This is the Bitterroot chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution. And we are a part of the Montana State DAR, which is a part of the National Daughters of the American Revolution. And we're a hands-on women's service organization. Our mission is historic preservation, education, and patriotism. So I will introduce Angela Reinbach, who will give us a little bit about what's going on.
Thank you, Glenn. Hello, we're so glad you all can be with us here today. Today we're going to have a wonderful presentation of an actress who's going to reenact a lifetime of Nancy Cooper Russell. But in the process of doing this, we have been given the gift of a grant from the MCAT station here in town. And they're going to be putting this on television for us, and it's also going to be downloadable from their website. And that should be within about a week downloadable, and then on channel 189 in about a month. So we're so grateful to MCAT for coming to be a part of this and for giving us the grant to be able to share it with the world. And I'm going to introduce to you Janet Loran, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the program, a little bit more about our actress, and when she comes forward, we'll go right into the filming. So just a couple of tips with the filming. We're going to try to keep our interaction quiet unless the actress asks for it. And we're going to try to keep ourselves low out of the film range for the camera. But do remember channel 189 in about a month or so, and you can go to that website within the week and be able to download it, stream it, and watch it and share it with other people and in schools and your own organizations and everything. So thank goodness that MCAT is partnering with the DAR Bitterroot chapter for this, and I'd like to introduce to you Janet Loran.
We want to welcome you all. I'm just here to introduce our main attraction. So today we're delighted to welcome here Mary Jane Bradbury. She's a member of the Humanities Montana Speakers Bureau. The title of her program today is Kid Gloves and Brass Knuckles, The Life of Nancy Cooper Russell. Mary Jane Bradbury is a scholar and actress with over 25 years of experience who brings history to life for audiences of all ages in the Rocky Mountain region. She's a member of both the Humanities Montana and Colorado Humanities Speakers Bureau. Now as to Nancy Cooper Russell. Many of you know the story of Charlie Russell, who came to Montana as a 16-year-old boy and spent his early years as a cowboy before deciding to become an artist full-time. But if Charlie had a lot of talent for art and storytelling, he had little talent for business. It was his wife, Nancy Cooper Russell, who gets credit for making him the successful artist that he became. But few know the story behind this remarkable woman. Please welcome now Nancy Cooper Russell.
Oh, my goodness. Huh. Oh, 1935. 1935. Where does the time go? Where does the time go? Sometimes I wonder if I'll have enough time to get everything done that I want to in this life. Does that ever happen to you? You just think you might run out of time before you get everything done that you want to. And, well, 1935, things have changed a lot. Charlie's been gone for 9 years now. I miss him every day still. And this summer, Will Rogers died. And oh, if you know him now, he was a storyteller, a philosopher, and a good friend of Charlie's. I can't imagine all those years ago when we met him in New York City. Charlie and Will, no one knew who either of them were, and they had no idea they would become so famous. Will used to say that he was trying to sell a few stories, a few rope tricks for vaudeville, and that Charlie was trying to sell a few paintings. But he had that wrong. I was trying to sell a few paintings, and Charlie was trying not to get lost in New York City. He never liked New York. He called it the big camp with the tall teepees. And he was always trying not to get lost in New York. Oh, Who would have thought a girl coming from where I came from would end up trotting in double harness with Charles M. Russell, and that would we work together to leave his legacy of art and stories? I know people criticize me for holding out on my prices for Charlie's work like I do. But there never will be any more Russell art. So, if you want it, you need to pay for it. Will Rogers would appreciate my perspective on this. Will used to tell this story on Charlie, that Charlie would make a painting, sell it for a few dollars if he could, and if he couldn't, he'd put it over the bar for a round of drinks for himself and his friends. Then Charlie got married. The last Russell had gone over the bar. Nancy said, "You paint these things, and I will attend to the distribution end of the enterprise." And then Will would say, every story needs a moral. And the moral of this one is, if you're going to paint, know what you're painting about. If you're going to marry somebody who can manage you right. Well, manager is probably one of the kinder things I've been called. Insatiable Nancy. Now, that's what Mr. Armstrong called me after I sold one of Charlie's paintings for the largest price, the highest price ever paid to a living artist. And Nancy the Robber, some of Charlie's less charitable friends called me that because they thought that I robbed them of his time with Charlie and that I robbed people of their money by charging like I did for Charlie's work. Well, Charlie's friends couldn't afford his art. And he couldn't afford to be kept from making it for those who could. Now, that's just good business. But a woman practicing good business gets called an awful lot of unflattering things. I didn't know anything about Charlie or his art when I met him, but I knew he knew about art, and I knew he could be something special if we could just figure out how to do it. Who would have thought a girl coming from where I came from would end up trotting in double harness with Charlie Russell, and that we'd work together to leave his legacy of art and stories? Well, there we were, Charlie and I. Sometimes in those days I used to think about fate. I don't know if any of you ever think about fate. And what I mean by that is one thing happens, and then another thing happens, another thing happens, and pretty soon, when you look back, you realize all those things had to happen in just that order, or life wouldn't come out the way it did. And so, with regards to Charlie and me now, when Charlie came west, he was following his dream. It was his dream to see the West. He'd grown up on stories about it, the buffalo herds and the native peoples, and he wanted to see it before it was gone. I was born on a tobacco farm in Kentucky, and our family was very poor. I couldn't go to school. I didn't have much of a sense of the world at all. And when my stepfather brought my mother, my half-sister, and me from Kentucky out to Helena, Montana, and left us there, a couple of years later when my mother died, my stepfather left me behind. 15 years old, I didn't have anywhere to go. So what were my dreams? Well, I dreamed of a hot meal. And I dreamed of shoes that didn't have holes in them. And I dreamed that tomorrow would be better than today. But when I look back on all that, I realized that if that old stepfather of mine hadn't brought us west, and if he hadn't left me behind when my mother died, I never would have met Charlie Russell. So there. Sometimes you just have to stick with your story and do your best and see how it comes out. Now, there I was. I got a job over in Cascade with the Roberts family. They were very kind to me. And one night, Mr. Roberts said, "Now, Nancy, we have a friend coming for supper. His name is Charlie Russell, and he's an artist." Well, now, what in the world do I know about art coming from where I came from? Well, Mr. Roberts said, here, take a look at some of these pictures. Well, I took a look at these. They were sketches. Sketches that Charlie had made, and there were cowboys racing through town and shooting up the air, and horses causing dust and commotion, and cows being roped and thrown into the dirt. And I thought, this Charlie Russell must be some sort of wild man. And I didn't even know if I wanted to meet him. Excuse me. Well, have you ever made up your mind about someone or something before you really had all the information, and then found out later you were terribly wrong? I couldn't have been more wrong about Charlie Russell. Oh, my, that night he came for supper. Now, I've told this story so many times. I was standing in the kitchen with a plate of sliced ham, and I heard boots on the porch boards outside. And then the kitchen door flew open, and Mr. Roberts called out, "Leela, Charlie's here." And there he stood. Well, he wasn't a dirty old cowboy. He was a little dusty from the road and such, but he walked over into the corner of the kitchen and poured some water in the basin to wash up for supper. And then when he was drying his face, he peeked out around the towel and he winked at me. And I'm still standing there with that plate of sliced ham. Well, all through dinner that night, old Charlie kept us entertained and told stories. And, well, after that he asked if he could come calling, and of course I said yes. We'd walk by the river, or we'd sit in the Roberts front parlor, and he'd say, Nancy, what do you want from your life? Well, what did I know to want from my life? I was a woman, a marriage and a family, I suppose. What did I want from my life? Well, I didn't want to be hungry again. And I wanted to learn to set a proper table. Now, I was raised in some pretty modest circumstances, and I didn't even know anything about a proper entertaining. And so I wanted to learn that, and I wanted to learn to speak good English. I didn't have any schooling, as I said, and, well, I embarrassed myself and everybody within hearing distance every time I opened my mouth. People there said it would be a very poor match. Charlie Russell, coming and going all those years on the prairie, what sort of a husband would he make? And me, besides the fact that I didn't know very much, my health wasn't very good. The doctor there in Cascade said, Charlie Russell, don't you marry that Cooper girl. She'll be dead in 3 years. But what Charlie didn't let people know about himself was that he didn't give his word very often because he knew he'd have to keep it. So then, in 1896, in the front parlor of the Roberts home, when Charlie Russell gave his word to me, why, I never doubted he'd be true to me. We were married, and Charlie liked to call things by their cowboy terms. So he called marriage being necked. Now, that's when you tie a rope around the neck of a wild horse, tie the other end of the rope around the neck of a tame horse, and the tame horse teaches the wild horse some manners. That's the only way to hold a bunch quitter, he would say. And I don't know which one of us he thought would quit the bunch, but neither of us ever did. And he told a friend that he hoped the rope would never choke or break. We came from such different places. Charlie Russell grew up in a home, a family. They were prosperous, and he had everything he wanted, including a lot of love. I was raised on that old tobacco farm, and I have to tell you, every year was a question. If the market was good when we took the tobacco harvest to town, well, there might be supplies and new shoes for the coming year and such. But if the market was poor, well, there were no necessities and certainly nothing extra. So it's probably just as well I didn't go to school in those days. So I looked pretty shabby some of the time. Well, there we were, Charlie Russell and I, married Charlie wanted to make his living as an artist, but he didn't know a thing about it. And, well, he said, maybe I'll go back to being a cowboy. I'd rather be a starving cowboy than a starving artist. And I said, Charlie, you'd be neither. You'd be a starving cowboy wishing you were an artist, and besides that, you've got me to think about. So we'll figure this out. Now, the first thing we did was move from Cascade up to Great Falls, because that's a very different town. Oh, lots of people traveling through Great Falls, and more exposure for Charlie's art, certainly. And, well, we hadn't been there very long when Mr. Schatzline from Schatzline's Hardware over in Butte came by. He said, Charlie, I want to buy some more paintings to sell in my hardware store. Now, I always thought it was strange that art would be sold in a hardware store. But I was told that's where folks in Montana would be looking for it. And he said something else. He said, Charlie, you ought to raise your prices. I sold one of the paintings from the whole bunch that I bought from you last time for as much as I paid you for the whole bunch. Your work is worth it. People like your work. Well, Charlie Russell didn't care what happened to his art after he made it. He just wanted to make art. But I would have been blind not to see that opportunity. There comes a time in your life when you know what you're supposed to be doing, and right then and there I knew I was supposed to be helping my husband. So, the very first chance I had, I stepped in. Charlie had made a little painting for the mayor's wife, and I asked if I could deliver it. Now, Nancy, he said, don't you ask for more than $25 or she won't take it. So I got to the mayor's house there, and his wife looked at the picture. Oh, she was tickled. She said, how much? $35, I said. Wait right here and I'll get you a check. When I showed that check to Charlie, he was as happy as he was so many years later when Doheny paid $30,000 for a commission. I think as time went on, he just pretended to be appalled at the way I ran our business endeavors, but he did leave that to me. Well, now in 1900, Great Falls, Charlie got a little inheritance from his family, so we built our home there. Oh, first roof over my head that didn't belong to somebody else. It was a lovely home. It had a formal dining room. I had learned to set a proper table, and a parlor, a kitchen and pantry, and upstairs 3 bedrooms and a water closet. Upstairs, mind you, and the eternal fragrance of turpentine. Where was Charlie going to paint? There in the front parlor. Well, we knew we had to make some changes about that. So Charlie said if he ever had a studio, he would like it to be like the cabin that he lived in with Jake Hoover the first year that he came to Montana. So I said, all right, and I ordered the only poles I could get in those days, decommissioned cedar telephone poles. And they came up the street there, pulled by a span of draft horses on a big flatbed right into our neighborhood, and the studio started to be built. Well, those walls were about this high, and a neighbor came over one day and said, Charlie Russell, what are you building there, a corral? I don't know what happened to Charlie, but right then and there he disowned that project. He didn't want anything more to do with it. I don't know if he thought maybe a humble little log cabin in our fine neighborhood would not be acceptable, but, well, I had to see it finished. And when it was finished, I thought, well, it's going to just sit there and never be used until one night our neighbor, Mr. Trigg, he came over and he said, Charlie, now I've been looking at that fireplace from the outside, and I'd really like to go inside and take a closer look at it. Is that all right with you? Well, I was doing supper dishes, and I thought, oh, I just will hold my breath and see how this works out. Well, it wasn't 20 minutes. Charlie came running back in. Oh, Nancy, he said, that cabin will do just fine for a studio. I will put all of my materials in there, all of my collections, and I can work there, but the bunch can come and visit, and I can cook campfire suppers over that open hearth fireplace. And true to Charlie's vision. That's exactly what happened. Charlie worked in that studio. I don't think he finished a painting that he wasn't in that studio. And the bunch came to visit, much more often than I would have appreciated. They usually came when I was out of town, you see. But Charlie loved having his friends. Loved having his friends around, and he would cook those campfire suppers. No one was allowed to come near while the cooking was taking place, you see, but then he would make bachelor bread and boiled beans and coffee, of course, bacon, game if it was the right time of year. He was always so happy when somebody asked for seconds, because he wasn't the best cook in the world. Then he'd get the makings, Bull Durham and some white papers, and he'd sit back on his heels and roll himself a smoke, and then he and his friends would spend the rest of the night into the wee hours of the morning telling stories, drifting back over the old days, and finest Western artist this country has ever seen, and all he ever really wanted to do was sit there and tell stories with his friends. Oh, Charlie Russell. Well then, 1903, they were planning a big exhibit in St. Louis for the 100th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Purchase expedition. And they were going to make sure that the theme was American art. Well, who better to have paintings in that exhibition than Charlie Russell? But we had to take the paintings there so that they could see them and decide whether they wanted to include Charlie. So we went from Montana to St. Louis, and before we left, we had been told by a number of people, including a couple of artists from New York City, Will Crawford and John Marchand, that New York was the place to be. Charlie, if you want your work to be known, you've got to go to New York. That's where the publishers are. That's where the galleries are. Well, Charlie never liked leaving Montana in the first place. Going to St. Louis was enough of a journey for him, but I was determined that we were going to go the rest of the way to New York. And my definition of determined is separate from Charlie's. So there we were, got onto a train there in St. Louis and off to New York City, and oh, I can't imagine why Manhattan Island didn't just sink under the weight of those buildings. And when we got to the train station, I wanted to take one of those new motor cars. It's 1904. I thought we should step right into the modern age, but Charlie wouldn't have it. So we took an old hack, and when we got to the Park View Hotel, there was no park and there was no view. I didn't think Charlie would even give New York a chance. We had a tiny little closet of a room and a grimy, filthy window looking out over a dirty old alley. And, well, Charlie looked up those friends of his, Mr. Marchand and Mr. Crawford, and when he got to their studios, well, he felt right at home. They had their own collections of Western items, and one of them even had a pot of beans bubbling over an old hot plate. And that even smelled like home for Charlie, so he spent his time with them. He modeled the first model that we had cast into bronze. Smoking Up, it was called. And, well, Charlie had found a place for him to feel a little more comfortable. And what was I doing? I was walking the streets of New York with paintings under my arms, from gallery to publisher to gallery to publisher, trying to figure out the art business. Now, as a young woman alone in the streets of New York City in 1904, I learned about a lot more than the art business. But I did learn about it, what it would take to position my husband so that he would get considered for some of these commissions. How could he be accepted into the magazines and even as an illustrator for some of them? When we left New York that year, I had sold a painting, and I had commitments from Leslie's and Scribner's and Outdoor Magazine to use Charlie's art and stories in the coming months. There would be many more trips to New York City, and I got better and better every time I went at negotiating a good price for Charlie and driving a good hard bargain on behalf of his work. Our friend Joe DeYoung said that no matter what kind of gloves Nancy's wearing, velvet or suede or leather, they contain a pair of brass knuckles. I wonder sometimes if those men didn't cringe when they saw me coming, because they knew I wouldn't back down. We met a lot of people in New York. Well, that was our first big outing into the world that year. Charlie made so many friends over the years. Charlie once said he had friends when he had nothing else. It's what he really cared about in this life, his friends, the people. I tried to be more like him in that way, but it seems no matter how hard I tried, well, people just didn't take to me the way they took to Charlie. I remember one time, it was in Great Falls, there was a fundraiser, 1916, a fundraiser for the war effort. The maids and matrons of Great Falls, the society ladies, they were holding this fundraiser. Now, I'd always hoped that they would accept me into their ranks as one of them, but they never did. But as Charlie Russell became more and more famous, having Mrs. Charles M. Russell as the chairman of your event became a feather in anybody's cap. And I just didn't take those jobs so that I could get my name in the program. I always worked. I worked like 60 on this one. And when we were finished, we had raised more money than anybody thought was possible. And after I distributed the money, and then some, I took what was left and I bought supplies, blankets and food and such for the Cree Indians, the starving people across the river there in Great Falls. And when those maids and matrons found out what I'd done with the money, they said they never would have worked so hard if they thought I was going to give that money to a bunch of dirty Indians. I can't imagine anybody would say something like that, let alone think it. When I talked to Charlie about it, I was furious, and he wasn't happy either, but he said, "Nancy, you have to calm down. Those ladies have probably never, ever really been hungry. And they have no idea what it's like to live in a tent in the wintertime." Of course, he was right. Of course, he was right. Maybe that's how Charlie Russell forgave me some of my faults. That what I'd been through in my life had given me my particular temperament. And I do have a temper. When it flares, Charlie just always gave me a wide berth and said I never really learned to control it. Well, I admit to you, I struggled with that quality in myself. Afraid that I might not live up to his expectations of me as his friend, as his partner, his companion. The trails are not always smooth, but love and understanding make the toughest trails easier, and no matter what we were going through, we always had that for each other, love and understanding. Well, in 1911, we put together The West That Is Past, our first exhibit in New York City, The West That Is Past. And wasn't there a 2-page interview with Charles M. Russell, including illustrations, in the paper? And one of the reviewers wrote that Charlie Russell has a big heart, and he paints it across canvas such that the viewer can smell the incense of the prairie. And in that article, he was compared to Frederic Remington. Remington had been dead for 2 years at that point. Charlie Russell compared to Frederic Remington, and, well, we sold the painting, and went home. I was thrilled because we really had launched ourselves on that particular exhibit. And it came so fast after that, we were hardly prepared. The Montana state had a new state house, and they wanted a mural for the House of Representatives chamber, and Charlie said, if you want cherubs flitting through the skies and such, like those New York painters give you, then hire one of them. But if you want history, you hire me. So they did. Charlie painted Lewis and Clark meeting the Indians at Ross's Hole. Now that canvas, mind you, was 12 feet by 25 feet. We had to raise the roof on that log cabin studio, 3 logs, in order to get that canvas in there and then get it stretched. And Charlie'd never painted anything that big. When it hangs in the Capitol now, it fits in that room, which is gigantic, but in that tiny little studio, it took up the entire space, wall to wall, in all directions. Charlie didn't know what to do. He wrote to his friends in New York and said, I've never painted anything like this. And they said, Charlie, you quit complaining and get yourself a ladder and get up there and start working. And he did. And oh, when it was finally hung there, I know it would be hailed as a masterpiece. It has been. But the thing I'm most proud of is right there in public. Right there for everyone to see. So much of Charlie's art will end up in galleries and private collections, but that piece is right there for everyone to come and look at. Another commission we got just a year or so after that New York exhibit was When the Land Belonged to God. Oh, I think that's my favorite piece, because I think it took a piece of Charlie's soul to make it. It's a herd of buffalo coming up out of the Missouri River, and the lead bull is looking right smack dab into the face of the viewer. And then the rest of the herd goes down into the water and up the other side and into the distance, and you can see dust miles and miles away. But it's that lead bull that caused Charlie so much distress. I would go into the studio one day, and that lead bull was facing to the left. And then I'd go in the next day, and he's facing to the right. Charlie just couldn't decide where he wanted that bull to be looking, until he finally made his mind up, and that bull looked straight out at the viewer. A very powerful way for that painting to be finished. So there we were. Charlie's fame was growing. Will Rogers had been wanting us to come to California for years. Will Rogers was out there making silent moving pictures. And he wanted Charlie to come and see what it was all about. And finally, in 1920, we did. Went to California, to Hollywood. Charlie loved going on those movie sets. He was fascinated by the whole thing. He said, Nancy, I never saw a cowboy come riding over a hill and get shot off his horse, get back up and go up and ride over that hill again 10, 12, 15 times. Can you imagine that Charlie thought moving pictures would take away people's desire for art? He thought that would replace people wanting paintings and such, and actually it was just quite the opposite. So many of those early directors and producers were taking their cues on how to frame and compose their moving pictures by the art that had been created by those who saw the West, one of whom was Charlie. Oh, there we were, Charlie Russell. Charlie Russell always said that Nancy lives for tomorrow and I live for yesterday. Nancy does the business and I do the creative, and so what she says goes. Between us, we make a pretty good pair. He's right. But art wasn't just a profession for Charlie. It's the way he looked at the world. He thought in pictures. And all those years when he came to Montana, when he was just a boy, really, all those years cowboying, listening to all the old-timers tell their stories of the buffalo herds and the native peoples. He kept all of those stories and images in his mind. And that's where he worked from. That was a special place that he had. And, oh, I could do the business, handle our domestic life, take care of all the exhibits and the framing and the copyrights and the correspondence and the travels and the shipping, and endure the way he thought I charged too much for his work. But I couldn't be with him in his own particular world. One of my fondest memories of Charlie is sitting in the parlor in the evening, and Charlie's there with a pad and pencil just working out some idea. And I knew in the coming days that idea would spill out onto canvas there. But he was content to be in that world by himself. When people called Charlie a genius, he'd say, I'm just a cowboy with a paintbrush. I do the painting, and Nancy does the business. And I think he appreciated my efforts. Well, I know he did. I know he appreciated me as a woman at a time when a lot of women weren't doing the kinds of things that I was doing. Charlie once said that a woman can go further with a lipstick than a man with a Winchester and a side of bacon. And I believe that he didn't say that just because he thought women got by on their charms. He said in nature, you know, it's the females that lead the bunch. I said, Charlie, it might work out for buffalo and horses to let the females lead the bunch, but it's going to be a while before people realize that women can lead their own bunch in this life. When I look back at those years early on in New York City, I didn't know anything. And those gallery owners and publishers, I'm sure they didn't see me as anything more than a charming little woman with some paintings to sell. They gave me no credit whatsoever for having any business sense. And I didn't care about that. I only cared that Charlie knew I had it. Well, in 1926, we started to build a home in Pasadena. Montana winters were getting very, very tough on both of us. But Charlie was sick that year, and we had been coming on for quite a while, but he had goiter, and it wasn't such a difficult thing to correct in those days, but Charlie left it go for so long. Finally, we visited Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and the surgery for the goiter was very successful. But the doctors took me aside and said that Charlie's heart was damaged, and that he didn't have very long to live. And they took Charlie aside and told him the same thing, and we each told the doctor not to tell the other one. So when we left there, we each thought we knew something that the other one didn't. I wish we could go back to that summer. Back to that summer. Time is the one thing you really run out of. One day, one of Charlie's friends from the early Cowboy and Times and the Judith came by. They were sitting on the front porch of the house there, and his friend said to him, Charlie, do you ever get out riding anymore? And Charlie said, no, I throwed my last leg over a horse. He sounded so resigned. And, well, if there's a heaven, and I believe there is, Charlie throws his leg over a horse every day, and he rides out across prairies that go on and never end, and he sits around campfires that never burn out and tells his stories to his heart's content. You know, some of my favorite times with Charlie were when we weren't traveling. We had no obligations of any kind, just there in Great Falls. I went about my chores, and Charlie went about his painting, and he always got up every morning and fixed breakfast. And then he'd bring me my tea. And if the light wasn't quite right, if it was raining or something, he'd sit there on the bed. We'd sit quietly, as if 3 commissions were out there in the studio waiting for him, and a dozen letters of correspondence were sitting on my desk waiting for me, we'd just sit quietly. And then he'd go off and paint. He always came in for lunch, washed those brushes. Oh, he's so particular about his brushes. Set them there on the kitchen counter. And then in the afternoon, he liked to spend it with his friends. Or maybe we'd go riding there around the area of Great Falls. But we were always home by supper. Chores got done, supper, and then afterwards we'd walk, just like we did in those early, early days of knowing each other. We'd walk down there by the river. Nancy, he said, we have a good life. Oh, really, I said, Charlie, you don't miss the old days? No, he said, I got 'em all right here now. And he'd tap his forehead. People give me credit for making Charlie Russell famous and wealthy. And I have done nothing unusual except love and support the only Charlie Russell in the world, and believe in a talent that he took for granted. I did my part trotting in double harness to keep him from quitting the bunch. And I think anybody who looks at a piece of Charlie Russell art knows that they're part of his bunch. I just kept him from wandering off. Well then, I've been talking for some time now. Does anybody have any questions about this story or Charlie's life or mine? Yes.
Were there any children involved at any point?
Were there any children involved in our life? Well, we never had children of our own. But in 1916, we adopted a little baby boy. We named him Jack. Charlie loved children, and he came to live with us. We fell head over heels in love with him. He was 9 years old when Charlie died. And then right away, Jack and I moved to Pasadena. The house there was finished. And Jack rather would have gone to school, boarding schools in some cases. Do you have children?
No.
Oh. Well, does anybody here have children? Maybe they can agree with the fact that you don't always see eye to eye with your children. That's sort of how Jack's and my story came out. Any other questions? Yes.
This isn't a question, but my husband's great uncle, Sir Hoyson Charlie Brewster, a neighbor he called it.
Charlie Russell's funeral, indeed. Mr. Brewster, wasn't he one of the first people that ever hired Charlie in Montana? After he gave up watching sheep, that's the reason that he first came out here. He had a job watching sheep. Well, Charlie didn't want to watch sheep. He doesn't even like them very much. And I think Mr. Brewster was one of the first people to hire him as a cowboy. Charlie knew that he was not going to be living too much longer. He said, Nancy, don't you have me carried to the cemetery in one of those skunk wagons. He did not like automobiles, and so he asked for a hearse. And it took some time to find one. Most people had relegated those to the junkyard by that time, but we found one. Yes. Well, there's memories for you. Yes.
Can you tell the story of when he was watching someone's cattle over in the Jude Gap area when they had the bad winter? He painted that picture, the last of the 5,000 or something. And was it the man back in New York who owned them, the Thanksgiving?
Well, that's a great story, and I'm happy to tell it. You might think that Charlie's fame came from some grand oil painting that someone saw and said, oh, isn't this a great artist? It was not the case at all. Charlie came to Montana in 1880, and he didn't quit cowboying until 1893. So in 1886-87, now that was a winter to remember. Anybody who knows anything about Montana's history knows that. Everyone in the world thought that Montana was heaven on earth for the cattle business. So cattle were being brought into the state by the tens of thousands. It was a dry summer, And those cattle got to Montana. There wasn't a lot of food and there wasn't a lot of water, and they were tired and hungry, and winter came early, and it came fierce, and it came such that sometimes those poor cattle were frozen into the ground. They couldn't even pick their feet up, let alone use their muzzles to push away the snow and get down to what grass there might be. And that started as early as November, and it lasted the whole winter. Well, long about February, Charlie was on the OH ranch, there in the bunkhouse, listening to the wind and the snow, and the foreman said, you know, I got a letter from Mr. Kaufman, lives in town. The owners lived in Helena at the time. He wants to know how the cattle are doing. And I can't even figure out how to compose a letter to him. And so Charlie said, well, wait a minute. And he picked up a little piece of cardboard, and he sketched out a starving cow. His ribs are showing, and his tail's been chewed off, and oh, my heavens, surrounded by a few wolves waiting their turn. And he said, why don't you just put this in with your letter? And then the foreman took one look at it and said, I don't even have to write a letter. I'll just send this. And he did, and of course when the owner got the letter, he got the message. But he also thought that was pretty clever. This cowboy artist out there making a picture that told the whole story, so he passed it around Helena. And it wasn't long before most people had seen it, and those who hadn't seen it had heard about it. And actually ended up with Ben Roberts, the family where I met Charlie. He had a saddle shop there in Helena, and he had that tacked up on his wall, and the newspaper reported about this cowboy artist depicting the conditions of the winter that year, and sure enough, that's the first time Charlie appeared in print, and after that his reputation began to grow. That little tiny bit of cardboard, a scrap really. But Charlie was a storyteller at heart. Yes?
Wasn't it titled The Last of the 5,000?
The Last of the 5,000, I believe. Another title was Waiting for the Chinook. Yeah, Waiting for the Chinook. I don't know how anyone in Montana would wish for wind, but they were wishing for it that year. Yes?
When you moved to Sacramento, did you keep the house in Great Falls?
Well, we actually moved to Pasadena. I moved. We started that house before Charlie died, and then as soon as he was gone and I settled my affairs, I moved to Pasadena. But I felt, wouldn't it be grand if that studio could become a memorial to Charlie? And so I left the studio to the city, and then they decided they would buy the house. So the house and the studio have been preserved, and it was, well, Charlie died in 26, I think, in spite of the economic hardship on people by 1929 and 30, that home and studio opened to the public as a memorial for Charlie in 1930. Yes. And I hope it will stand forever. Well, what I might do very quickly is make it a little easier for you to ask some questions that I might not be able to answer here in 1935. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I shall be right back. Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for letting me share my interpretation of Nancy Cooper Russell. Certainly now you have a sense of who she was, where she came from. I can't think of two more different people. Her background and the chance situation that she would be in the Roberts home that night to meet Charlie. And of course, Charlie came from a totally different place. A family that loved him. He had anything he wanted and didn't want it. He had everything she wished for and had to create for herself. So the two of them collided here in Montana, and we have all the wonderful art as a result. So are there any questions about this story now that I can answer? Yes?
I was curious, one of my favorite paintings of Charlie Russell is his East Meets West, is the name of it, and it's a picture of from the east, dressed in a blue dress, her nose up a bit, her chin tilted, and alongside, against the wood siding of an old building, is a lady that's an old Indian lady. And she's got a younger Indian lady beside her, and she's kind of scoffing at the woman walking down the boardwalk in her fancy dress and her chin up. And I just love that, and I just wondered, was that Charlie's rendition of Nancy?
Oh. You know, that's one thing. I do this program for school children, and that's one thing I tell them, is that the viewer, the mind and the heart of the viewer are what make the story. And that's what Charlie wanted. He wanted his paintings to provoke memories or provoke the viewer to tell more stories. And I never thought of that way. I don't think it was Nancy specifically. Charlie didn't do a lot of paintings of white women. He didn't use white women much at all in his paintings. But he painted a lot of Native women, a lot of Native families. He wanted to tell the story from the point of view of the Native people. And so there were many domestic pictures of them. He was able to experience living with them for a few months in his early years. And so he did paint them. But as far as white women, and it's interesting, they have put together a exhibit of, it's called Charlie Russell and the Women in His Life. And it talks about that aspect of it. It talks about the influence at the time of Asian art and the Middle Eastern art at the time. You'll think harem pants, think Howard Pyle's illustrations and such. That all influenced him, but he rarely painted Western women, or white women. So, the answer to your question, I don't believe that was the case for Nancy.
Follow-up to that, I'm a person with the Japan Kumamoto, Montana Club, and Monty Dolok had a showing. It was an opening of one of his paintings in his studio here, and it happened to be my birthday, and my husband and I went to this Japan, this open house, and I'm standing there, and I have the East Meets West of Charlie Russell painting in our living room. And I was standing in front of one of Dolok's paintings, and my husband's just grinning at me with a silly look on his face, and finally says, "Turn around." And here Monty Dolok had done, he has been in Kumamoto, Montana, Japan also. He had done a painting, and it was of the things of Missoula in Montana and the things in Japan in this portrait. And my husband said to me, he says, "Look at the title." And I looked at the title, and the title was East Meets West. And so I asked Monty, I said, "Did you know Charlie Russell has one of his is East Meets West?" He says, "No, he did not realize that." But I do those three cultures when I teach, and I was so surprised. It was just so perfect. My husband bought me that painting that night.
Good.
Cool. So that's so special.
My question was, where was Charlie born?
Charlie was born in St. Louis. St. Louis. That's where his family. Robinson Russell Brick Company. His parents wanted him to take over the brick business. And you can look all around Montana, and there are Russell bricks in a lot of these buildings. Sometimes it's on the little historic marker, but it was a very prosperous business.
What was the highest value painting that you know that he did?
In his lifetime was that Doheny Commission. Edwin Doheny, if you know that Teapot Dome scandal that was about the oil and gas and coal leases in the West, the big scandal in the government, imagine that. Showing favoritism, and Doheny made a ton of money. He commissioned Charlie. It was the last commission of his life. They got it in 1925. And he had this, like a library, and up above on top there was a little kind of a little section. There was a piece of wood around the ends, and then above there was this blank border. And he wanted these panels about the history of the West to be up there. And so Nancy, you know, of course, she wanted to get this big commission for Charlie. And Doheny said yes, and so it was Charlie painted, and you know, from the early times to the native people, and then there were miners, and then a railroad, and then Doheny wanted oil derricks in the back and end of it, and Charlie just did not want to put those in. So he did finally. It looks like they're an afterthought. It looks like he took the brush and went, and they're way up in a corner, and he figured out that he'd put them there because he in the house there was a stairway, and the very end of those panels ended up right up in the shadow where the stairway was. So no one would have to see that he actually painted those. And yes, he got $30,000 for that.
Yes. Did he ever paint you? And could you tell us a little bit more about your life, Nancy's life, after Charlie's death?
Absolutely. He did use Nancy as a model. There's pictures of Nancy dressed in a variety of costumes as a young woman. He had another couple of women that he would call in. Charlie rarely used live models. He didn't do portraits. He always had sort of action figures of people doing something in his paintings. And he did use Nancy initially for models, but not to be her. She just stood in a position so that he could get the position and use it for someone else. After Charlie died in 1926, Nancy left Great Falls. The Great Falls wasn't... People didn't like Nancy. She didn't make a lot of friends. Think about women in business in those days. I mean, she was really a unique individual, and she didn't have any mentors. Think about this. She's a young girl in her early 20s going, I'm just going to ask for this money for these art. You know, she just didn't know anything. So no one said to her, you know, Nancy, here's a good strategy. Or here, come, let me show you how to negotiate with people. She just learned on her own. And that turned a lot of people off. She stood between Charlie and the rest of the world, and you couldn't get to him except through her, and she wasn't always nice about it. She did some things that were really not very much in favor of even his close friends. So she didn't ever make it with the maids and matrons of Great Falls, and so she left right after he died. She and Jack moved to Pasadena, where she lived for the rest of her life, still managing Charlie's art and also brokering some other artists' art. Then in the summer, she'd come to Bullhead Lodge, which is their cabin on Lake McDonald. They bought that in 1905. The park was designated in 1910, so they were inholders, and the cabin still stands to this day. It's privately owned. She spent her summers there still. They spent their summers there from 1905 and up until the summer right before he died. That was such an important part of his life, to get out there in the natural world. He loved nature. He was just rejuvenated by it. He'd paint there. They had lots of visitors coming and going. And of course, she's right there managing everything. So she made a lot of friends in their worlds in New York and California. She's very good friends with Betty Rogers and the Rogers family, and Harry Carey Sr. They knew lots of people, but those were more the people who could appreciate her because they lived in a world much different than the people in Montana lived in. She died in 1940. She got ill in 1936, so I placed her story in 1935 so she can talk about all of their life together. But 1936 she became ill and was pretty much an invalid for the rest of her life. Although she still had great poise and grace about her dedication to Charlie. One of her admirers was William S. Hart, If you know that name, he was a matinee idol in the 1920s, and he was a bachelor. He never married, but on his dresser there was a picture of Nancy, and he visited her frequently when she was ill those last few years. So, what happened to Jack? Did you notice that I sort of avoided answering it? Yes, Jack moved with Nancy. They were not good parents. Why they adopted a little boy, I'll never know. They were not very good parents. They adopted him in 1916. There wasn't a lot going on in the art business then. There was a war going on, and eventually we got involved in it, so there wasn't a lot of traveling and exhibits and such. But as soon as the war was over and things got back up to normal, they traveled. Nancy continued to be focused on business. So little Jack was spoiled when they were home and then kept by neighbors when they were gone. It wasn't a real kind of parenting situation that you might imagine would have been better for Jack. And then after Charlie died, he was 9, they moved to Pasadena, and he did spend most of his time in boarding schools. He was very smart at electronics, of all things. He could take apart a radio, take apart a watch, put it back together. He was very mechanical. So he had a career with the California Department of Transportation helping to design the early highway systems. And he died in the 1980s. But they were estranged. She didn't leave him anything when she died. Before she did, she gave him for a wedding present, and she was opposed to the marriage anyway, but she gave him one of Charlie's masterworks, War Scars of the Medicine Whip, and he sold it immediately for the money. So she just said, that's that. Yes?
You see a lot of Russell art in different formats, calendars and things like that. Is there anywhere that you can get quality reproductions of his work?
Quality reproductions of Charlie's art. That's a good question. And I don't really have an answer for you, but if you called the Russell Museum, I would think they would have resources for that. That would be my best suggestion. It's true, because you get these poster reproductions and the colors off, even with the kinds of reproductive technology we have these days. It's tough to get good ones.
What was the story of Charlie's red sash?
Charlie's red sash. That sash was a Métis sash. He started wearing that right when they got to Montana. The story goes, they get to Montana, he's dressed from St. Louis, right? But he's been listening to the stories all his life, and he wants to be a Western guy. So he goes into this store, he buys this fringe buckskin thing. He looked like a clown, really, to the cowboys. But he wanted to establish that he was a Western guy. So from that it evolved into a soft shirt, not a boiled collared type shirt, soft shirt, and then he always wore that sash to sort of signify he was a Westerner, and it became his signature. He wore it with tuxedos as time went on. Nancy never required of him to wear one of those, what he called them, hard-boiled shirts. And she never made him do that if they were going to a formal occasion, but he always wore his sash and a soft shirt. Yeah. Yes.
Stories attached to the painting, and the world lay all before them. It was in Belt Valley, looking out over Belt Valley, of a Native American couple. My mother grew up in Armington and Belt, so I know that hangs in the Notre Dame library, but I wondered if there were any stories that you knew.
I don't know of any that, more than what you just said, I don't know any stories attached to that particular one.
Well, a friend of mine who grew up in a ranch family there told me he went to Notre Dame. He was a freshman and he was so lonely for home. And he went in the library and he saw that. And he said, oh my gosh, that's where my family house sits, right there where that couple's in. Oh. And he loved Milton, and that was the title of it. So I love that story, but I wondered if there was any story about the painting of it.
No, I know that Charlie was very particular about his backgrounds, and sometimes he'd put 2 or 3 landscapes or features in that didn't necessarily stand together, but they were always very accurate for what he'd seen in Montana. Yes?
I may have missed it, but I'm curious to know, when was Nancy born and when were they married?
Nancy was born in 1878. They were married in 1896. She was 18. Charlie was 31. Charlie was born in 1864, so it's quite an age difference in them. Yeah. Yes?
Did anyone ever, research Nancy's family going back for her?
Nancy's family going back prior to Nancy. So Nancy's family was fixture in Kentucky, the backwoods of Kentucky. And her maiden name, her mother's maiden name was Mann, M-A-N-N, and so they lived in Mansville, Kentucky. And there was her grandparents raised her before Nancy was born. Texas Annie Mann was her mother's name. Texas Annie Mann was married to John Cooper. John Cooper left before Nancy was born, and there's no real knowledge of whether he knew there was a child on the way or if he just left, but he was gone, so this child is born, and Nancy and her mother lived with her grandparents, her mother's father, and the grandmother was a step-grandmother who didn't like Nancy. So when Texas Annie married Cousin Tom, they left Nancy with her grandparents. Well, her grandmother didn't like her, so that's where came the work in the fields and don't go to school kind of a thing. So then her mother had another child, Ella. And then the grandfather died. Well, now the grandmother doesn't want her, so she goes back with her mother and the stepfather and the half-sister. And then they moved to Montana. He brought them all to Montana, left them in Helena, and went off to try and work. And there's a mother who's got tuberculosis and 2 little girls just left there. So there's not a lot known about that. Nancy never talked about those years, and you can only imagine what they had to do to stay alive. And there's only 2 real things that she said about her upbringing. The first one, and these were way after Charlie died and she was talking to friends and writing letters. One was in talking about Kentucky. She said the atmosphere wasn't very good down there. And then about her mother, she said, my mother didn't do the best job she could have. Now, as an interpreter and a woman and a person who's looked at a lot of lives and the circumstances under which people either thrive and go on or don't, I look at that and can only imagine what that little girl went through. And when she was 5, she had probably either diphtheria or rheumatic fever or something, and her heart was damaged. So all of her life she was subject to fainting spells, migraine headaches. So in the midst of all that she was doing, she was also, by sheer force of will, showing up every day through all this physical hardship. So that woman was made of very stern stuff. Yes?
Do you think she ever met Jeanette Rankin? They were contemporaries.
Do I think she ever met Jeanette Rankin? What a great question. And those kinds of things, and you're right, the years coincide. The Russells weren't very political. So when they were in New York City one time, they went to a suffrage meeting. And Charlie said, a bigger bunch of hellraisers I never saw bunched. As far as having any leanings, I mean, Nancy was doing what all those women were saying, I wish we could do this. We need rights so we can do this. She was just doing it. So but there aren't a lot of documents or letters that say, oh, you know, I think we should be doing this, or women should speak out, or whatever. So there's not that. They were aware there's a quote of Charlie's, I should know it, but I don't know it specifically. When he was talking about the horses and the buffalo, it's the female that leads the bunch, and now we've got a female leading the bunch in Washington until they come up with something better, is what he said. So that's what he said about Jeanette. But I think he appreciated women. His mother was strong. His grandmother was a very strong woman. She was widowed, and that woman grabbed up that family and took the bull by the horns, and he was raised around strong women. But as far as them actually meeting, there's no documentation.
They were on the other side of the mountains, and Rankins was a well-off family, and it seemed like the Russells weren't connected to well-off people. That wasn't their social.
Not in that regard, but they were definitely connected to well-off people who could buy that art. In others, you know, it was just a different...
Not the Great Falls Society.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we are, yes, see how I am? Oh, talking and talking, but thank you. Thank you for letting me share this story.